Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the virtual breakfast sessions. I'm Larry Sashin. Today we have somebody very, very interesting to talk to. But before we go into that, let us thank our sponsors, the people who are paying the bills. So first, there's expense reduction analysts. If you're interested in ROI, EBITDA, cash flow, call the experts at expense reduction analysts and Ed Flanagan, and they will find the glitches in your system. And Eastern Business Systems for the best in office equipment and office supplies. Call Eastern Business Systems. Oh, back to our show. So today we have somebody very interesting to talk to today. Saru, can you say hello to everyone and tell them who you are?
Hi, my name is Saru Jayaraman. I'm the co-founder and president of One Fair Wage. I also lead the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley.
Thank you, Saru. And Fred, say hi.
Good morning. I'm Fred Clashman. I'm the editor and publisher of Total Food Service. Thrilled that Saru could join us this morning.
Okay, so back to Saru. Saru, you know, the more I study the how food service people are paid, you have to go back to the history of how they were paid. Let's dial the clock back to post-Civil War times, because truthfully, in many states, it's not much different. So tell everybody how food service wages and tipping started.
Yeah, actually, well, I'd love to go pre-Civil War times because tipping actually originated in feudal Europe many generations ago. It was something that aristocrats and nobles gave to serfs and vassals, but always on top of a wage. In feudal Europe, servants were paid wages, salaries, and tipping was an extra or bonus that a duke or a lord or a king would give to servants on top of their wage or their salary. When the idea came to the States in the 1850s, Americans at first resoundingly rejected tipping. They said, this is a vestige of feudalism. We're a democracy. You should get good service regardless of how much you can afford to tip. And by the way, we think employers should pay their workers, not customers. And so up until 1853, waiters in the US, mainly in the Northeast, because much of the US didn't have restaurants, but in the Northeast and Chicago, waiters were mostly men. They got mostly only wages, actually no tips, because tipping was not prevalent. Tipping was not accepted in the United States. There was actually an anti-tipping movement when tipping first came to the United States. And in 1853, these waiters, these men, went on strike for higher wages. And in response, the restaurant industry started looking for cheaper labor. At first, after the men went on strike, they started hiring white women. But 10 years later, after emancipation, the restaurant industry thought it had found the jackpot in hiring newly freed Black women in particular, not paying them and telling them, you're not going to get a wage from us. You're going to live on this new thing that's come from Europe called a tip. Now, there were two industries, in fact, that did this. It was the restaurant industry post-emancipation hiring Black women, and the Pullman Train Company hiring Black men. Not everybody knows the Pullman Train Company, but it's pretty well known in labor circles. It's a luxury train liner that ran from the East Coast to the West Coast, headquartered in Chicago, hired tens of thousands of Black men as porters to carry white people's luggage on and off the trains. And these workers were also told, you're not going to get a wage, you're only going to get tips. There were other industries, occupations for Black workers coming out of slavery, like shoe shiners, who also were told, you're not going to get a wage. You're going to get the privilege of getting white people's tips. But the two biggest ones were the restaurant industry hiring Black women and the Pullman trains hiring Black men. Well, the Pullman train workers, Pullman porters, as they called them, started organizing for an actual wage and a union late 1800s, early 1900s. And in 1937, they won what we call one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top. And it really was in response to their organizing in Chicago that the National Restaurant Association came into being, first in Kansas City and then Chicago, and basically set roots, fought to make sure that the restaurant workers never got what the Pullman car porters got, which was a full wage with tips on top. And when the Pullman car porters won one fair wage in 1937, 1 year later, the Restaurant Association won the exemption of tipped restaurant workers from the first federal minimum wage law that passed in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody else got the right to a federal minimum wage, but tipped restaurant workers were excluded. And again, they were mostly Black women at the time. Fast forward from 1938 until 2024, tipped workers today are still overwhelmingly women, disproportionately women of color. So it's been women since 1853. It's been women of color, disproportionately women of color since early 1900s. And it's gone up by just $2 to $2.13 an hour, the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States of America in 2024. And up until a few weeks ago, 43 states, we just won Michigan, so it just became 42 states, continue with this legacy of slavery, persisting with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers that in most states is under $5 an hour for a workforce that's still overwhelmingly women and having to put up with the highest rates of economic instability and sexual harassment of any industry because they have to tolerate so much from customers in order to feed their families and tips.
Oh, that is so. Take. I mean, we're in New York, in the Northeast here. What do you find in the Northeast? We have a different minimum wage in food service. Why don't you talk about that a bit?
Well, unfortunately, New York is one of those 42 states now that persists with that legacy of slavery with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers that's 66% of the overall minimum wage. And although that may be higher than other states, New Jersey is still at $3.13. I mean, there are many states, Pennsylvania next door is at $2.83. So New York is certainly higher than neighboring states, but it's not enough for New York. I mean, the cost of living in New York does not, a $10 wage is not enough in New York City to survive. So much so that during the pandemic, we saw a mass exodus of workers from this industry in New York saying we simply cannot put up with this any longer. So let's talk for a minute about what happened during the pandemic in New York, because it's very important and very related to this issue. So on Friday, March 13th, as you all remember, the industry was shut down, the country was shut down. And that weekend, we started a relief fund for service workers, COVID relief fund for service workers. 300,000 workers applied, 30,000 workers applied from New York. 2/3 of New York tipped workers told us that they actually couldn't get unemployment insurance, not because of status, these were citizens, but because they were told by New York State that that sub-minimum wage was too low to qualify for benefits and that their tips did not count toward the calculation of unemployment insurance. So 2/3 of workers couldn't get state unemployment insurance. Many workers then reported when the federal unemployment insurance came around, they still couldn't access it because although they were eligible, the state had marked them as a denial, and therefore they were never able to access unemployment insurance. Also, what we find, the sub-minimum wage is such a complicated system. It gives way to a myriad of wage theft problems, a myriad of violations with the law. So we heard from so many workers during the pandemic, my employer just never paid me. I was living on tips. And so when I went to apply for unemployment insurance, they denied my claim. So 2/3 of workers who came to us said they couldn't get unemployment insurance, and they were forced to go back to work before they felt safe. Now, mind you, the CDC named restaurants the most dangerous place for adults to be during the pandemic. UCSF named restaurants the most dangerous place to work during the pandemic. And as a result of having to go back to work before it was safe, 12,000 restaurant workers died. We just got these numbers from the CDC this year. They finally broke out deaths by occupation. 12,000 restaurant workers died because they had to go back to work. They couldn't stay at home. They had no benefits. They had to go back to work before it was safe. For those that survived, the overwhelming majority reported that tips went way down because sales went down and harassment went way up. We heard from thousands of women. I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much to tip. That we heard that so often, so pervasively. We came up with a new term for it. We called it masculine harassment. And that treatment, combined with the fact that these workers were asked to enforce COVID protocols on the very same people from whom they had to get tips to make up their base wages, which was an impossible situation. They got yelled at, they got screamed at, they got harassed. We had a worker in upstate New York who was shot for trying to enforce these rules. um, trying to get tips from people from whom you are trying to enforce COVID protocols on was just an impossible situation. And New York lost more workers in the restaurant industry than any state in the United States. In fact, 1 in 10 restaurant workers left the industry nationally. 1 in 5 workers left the industry in New York. And the overwhelming majority, 70% of workers who left, said they were leaving due to low wages and the fact that tips had gone way down. And so, even though New York's sub-minimum wage is higher than neighboring states, it's not enough for people to live on. And that's been made obvious by the mass exodus of workers from this industry. I mean, restaurants do continue to struggle to find and retain people. And that is because these wages are not enough to live on. Now, I will say, to their credit, thousands of restaurants across the country started raising wages in response to the staffing crisis in order to recruit and retain staff. We tracked over 300 restaurants in New York, actually, excuse me, over 500 restaurants in New York that raised wages to a full minimum wage with tips on top in order to recruit and retain staff. And our association of, we call them high road employers, restaurant owners who are responsible and committed to a sustainable future for these service professionals, our association doubled in size to over 1,000 restaurant owners, supportive of raising wages, supportive of policy that would create a level playing field and require all businesses to pay a minimum wage with tips on top. So in New York, we've seen pretty dramatic change in the marketplace. And in neighboring states, we're seeing pretty dramatic change, not just in the marketplace, but also in policy that is leading to, I think, ultimate change in New York. So I did want to share that we won following all these marketplace changes, following the pandemic, we ended the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers in Washington, D.C., and I'm happy to talk about the actual positive results we've gotten from that happening in Washington, D.C. We passed this in Chicago, Illinois, in October of last year. And just 3 weeks ago, Michigan became the 8th state in the country and the first state east of the Mississippi to end this legacy of slavery. There are
That's
multiple states about to follow, and we hope New York is one of them.
that's it's a great, it's a sad, great, hard story that you just told. But what I want to do is let's talk about the birth and why One Fair Wage and what the organization is and what they do. It depends on where you read it. They're either the white the prince on the white horse, or they're the villain. So let's hear why One Fair Wage is important and what they are.
Yeah, so I started this work 22 years ago when I was asked to start a relief center for the workers from Windows on the World, which was the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1. On that morning, 73 workers died in the World Trade Center in that restaurant, and about 250 workers lost their jobs. And so the head waiter from Windows on the World, Fekak Mamdou, an immigrant from Morocco, and I started a relief center for restaurant workers in New York City called ROC, the Restaurant Opportunity Center. And what started as a relief center grew really rapidly. Workers from all over New York City and then all over the country started reaching out to us for help. And as an academic, I've always been an academic while, running these organizations. We wanted to run what we call participatory research, engaging workers and surveying one another about their top needs and concerns. And in New York City and everywhere we went all over the country, restaurant workers in surveys, thousands and thousands and thousands of surveys. Actually, in the end, I think we maybe collected over 20,000 surveys of restaurant workers, kept naming over and over and over again, it's my wages, it's my wages, it's my wages. That's the top problem for me. And that makes sense when you know that the restaurant industry is the number one fastest growing private sector employer in the United States, largest employer of women, youth, immigrants, people of color, and yet is still to this day the lowest paying employer in the United States of America. Not that there aren't great employers, I've named some of them that are paying a livable wage, but the overwhelming majority of workers in this industry are by far the lowest paid workers in America. Every year, the US Department of Labor releases a list of the 10 lowest paying jobs in the United States. And every year, 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs in America are in the restaurant industry. And so you don't have to take it from me, take it from the US Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics. These are the lowest paying jobs. And so it's natural that when you survey tens of thousands of workers, they say, my biggest concern is my wages, my wages, my wages, which is why we launched the campaign for one fair wage and started looking into why are wages so low, understanding the history of the issue, and fighting to change it. And that's the origin story of our organization. Today, we are 300,000 restaurant and service workers and over 1,000 restaurant owners, all working together to raise wages and improve working conditions for the hardworking service professionals in our industry.
Yes, now with the pay structure, are you finding that there is friction between front of house and back of house? One who is getting a fair wage and the other one that is getting an almost no wage. Um, I understand, at least the restaurants that I go to, that the wait staff makes more than some of the managers. Um, but the people who are sweating in 110 degrees and running back and forth, not necessarily so. So what do you do for that?
Yes, that is definitely been a long-standing issue that's been around a lot longer than I've been alive. The tension between front of house and back of house is a very long-standing issue. The difference between front of house and back of house incomes is not as great in the vast majority of restaurants, which are actually casual restaurants, as it might be in trendy or upscale or fine dining restaurants. In a in an IHOP or a Denny's or an Applebee's, or a very casual mom and pop Mexican restaurant, the front of house, even with tips, makes a comparable income to the back of house that earns a full minimum wage. But of course, in fine dining and in even upscale trendy, I would say you do see this tension between front and back. You do see this front tension between front and back in many restaurants, regardless of the income differentials. What's wonderful is that the 7 states that have gotten rid of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, now Michigan, thanks to our efforts, actually allow restaurants to share tips with all non-management staff between front of house and back of house. And that has created much better unity in a lot of restaurants where I live in California, but also all around the country, as a result of tips being able, everybody getting a full fair wage and tips being able to be shared between front and back. Now, we in 2016, some of you may know that when Donald Trump got elected as president of the United States, he tried to make tips the property of owners rather than workers. And we mobilized 400,000 people. And in a very weird moment of my career, I ended up working with, at that time, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on a bill that we got passed in April 2018, saying that tips are the property of workers now and forever. But if an employer pays everybody a full fair minimum wage with tips on top anywhere in the country, they are allowed to share tips between front and back of house if everybody gets paid a full minimum wage. Now, New York is one of only 2 states. New York and Massachusetts are the only 2 states left that have state law that prohibits tip sharing with back of house, even when you pay a full minimum wage. And that's what we're trying to change. I'm right now sitting in Boston. We have an initiative that's on the ballot this November that would phase out the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and allow tips to be shared. Once everybody gets paid a full minimum wage, tips to be shared between front and back. And that is very likely to pass. It's, 30 points ahead in the polling. Massachusetts is likely to become the first East Coast state to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And that will leave New York as the only state left in the United States of America that doesn't allow for tip sharing with the back of the house, even when you pay a full minimum wage, which is why we are trying to move policy that would both raise that sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and allow for tip sharing with the back of the house in New York. Why? Because we've seen it work so well in states and in restaurants that pay everybody a full minimum wage and tips are shared. It creates a better sense of unity between front and back. Everybody's working together to get those tips. Everybody's working together to provide the best meal that the customer wants. Everybody's working together because everybody gets paid by the employer and everybody shares in the tips that come in from the customers. We've
So,
also seen it actually reduce sexual harassment
okay.
for front of house workers.
So, Saru, respectfully, just asking the question, Shake Shack announced the closing of 7 restaurants in California last Friday. Is there anything to be read between the lines in terms of minimum wage and the closing of those restaurants? Is there just go ahead?
Yeah, I can actually share data showing that fast food, actually fast food work, we're not talking about fast food workers here, by the way. What I've been talking about is full service restaurants.
Okay, so that's important that we
New
distinguish that.
element,
Okay,
yeah.
right.
If you want to talk about fast food, I'm happy to do that. There's new data showing that the number of fast food jobs in California has gone up since the minimum wage went up. So I'm happy to share that. But Shake Shack is not a full service restaurant.
Right.
It does not have tipped workers. It
Right.
doesn't pay a sub minimum wage anywhere in the country. So it's not quite what we're talking about right
Right.
here.
Okay.
But I do want to share about California, to your point. In 2021, the National Restaurant Association was making kind of the argument I think you might be making that, raising wages would kill the industry, paying a full minimum wage would devastate, restaurants would close, jobs would be lost. In the same moment when the Restaurant Association was making that argument, Newsweek caught the CFO of Denny's, which is a full service restaurant and does pay a sub minimum wage in most of the country, caught the CFO of Denny's telling shareholders in an analyst call in Q1 2021 that actually it would be fine, he said, because Denny's California, according to his words, outperforms the system. Denny's grows faster in California than any other state in the US. Why? He said, the CFO, because we pay our people a full minimum wage with tips on top. And guess what they do? They bring their families to eat at Denny's because they can afford to do that. And when they do, our guest receipts are higher and the company grows. So we've actually seen all full service chains grow faster in California than any other state in the United States, including Denny's. And that's with paying a full minimum wage with tips on top.
Okay. So say I know nothing. Why is there such a problem?
Yes.
What is the logic? Why can't the two sides get together?
Well, I wish we could. We've tried a number of times to sit down with Andrew Rigie and the New York, City Hospitality Alliance and the Restaurant Association to say, look, I think we actually have some shared interests here. We want a sustainable growing industry. We want to have workers who can not only work in the industry, but stay in the industry. I mean, one of the greatest problems we all know this industry has is among the highest rates of turnover of any industry in the United States. And we've actually done the work with Cornell University to document how much turnover costs this industry. It is astronomical. It is not, captured in the books when you look at your P&L and your cash flow statements, but it is astronomical the amount of money restaurants have to spend to rehire, retrain, the amount of money you spend on sometimes employee theft or low morale or the inability to upsell because workers are not paid enough to feel invested in the company or to stay over the long haul. And we have actually tracked that paying your people a full minimum wage with tips on top can cut employee turnover in half, which is tremendous savings. So I think we have a lot in common. We want workers to work in the industry and to stay in the industry. We want to cut down costs like turnover. And I do think there's a shared interest in being able to share tips with the back of the house. We've heard that from a lot of employers, that we want to be able to share tips among all non-management staff. And so we have a lot of shared interests. I think there is, my answer to why is there still a problem is fear. There's fear of change. And I think what we are starting to see is change happening in a number of states and cities, and the sky is not falling. And I think I'm hoping that as more and more restaurants see that the sky is not falling as wages go up, that change is possible. So let's talk for a minute about Washington, D.C., because the Restaurant Association has definitely tried to spread a lot of fear mongering about Washington, D.C. We passed one fair wage, meaning raising wages from $5 in Washington, D.C. to $16.50 in November 2022. 1 year later, November 2023, we looked at the only government data that the DC Attorney General feels is a legitimate source of data for how many restaurants are in the district, which is the number of licenses that restaurants seek and apply for to operate a food business. The number of licenses from November 2022, when the bill passed, to November 2023, last November, went up 10%. I'm not saying that it was because the wage went up. I'm just saying that the number of restaurants did not go down. And in addition to that, we looked at U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics data in terms of the number of jobs and the incomes. And number of jobs in the restaurant industry went up 7% 1 year later, and the wages and tips went up 6.8% 1 year later. Then in April of this year, April 2024, the New York Times looked at our data and other data and confirmed the DC restaurant industry is doing just fine as the wage is going up from 5 to 8 to 10 and eventually to $16.50. The DC restaurant industry has not only survived, but pretty much continued as is. The number of restaurants, the number of jobs, and the tipping has remained pretty much the same. But you don't have to look at just DC, because DC is halfway through their process. We actually passed this in Flagstaff, Arizona 5 years ago, and Flagstaff, Arizona is in the final year of phase out of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And they actually have been growing quite rapidly. You might know Flagstaff is the city just outside of the Grand Canyon. There's lots of tourism. Nothing has changed. Restaurants still continue to grow. The number of jobs has not gone down, and tipping has remained exactly the same. And so I do hope that as we see cities like DC and Chicago and Michigan, I'm sorry, DC and Flagstaff and Chicago, and now the state of Michigan pass these laws, and that nothing is changing, that people can begin to understand that paying people a full minimum wage is good for workers, good for business, and good for everybody.
I guess what I have trouble understanding, and it's funny, I see a gentleman here who's in the insurance business that's on here today. They have salespeople that get paid on a commissionable basis with a base salary. Are we talking about getting rid of a model that has included motivation based on the level of service that I bring to every one of those tables and customers that I serve, et cetera? So I guess the piece of the question is, does this demotivate? And you've heard there are certain servers who've said they'd like to keep things the same, et cetera. Does this take the motivation out of the level of professional service that we see in many of our restaurants today?
So the overwhelming majority of workers, when polled in accurate scientific polls, always say, of course, I want a full minimum wage with tips on top. And that's the key, Fred, is that we're not talking about tipping going away. I'm sure when you travel to California or Las Vegas, you still tip. Everybody does. I do. Tipping is actually more robust in the states that have a full minimum wage with tips on top. Why? Because guess who are the best tippers? I would love for everybody here to guess who are the best tippers. The best tippers are restaurant workers by far, because they know what it's like to live on tips. And when they get paid more, they eat out more. That's what the CFO of Denny's was saying. And when they eat out more, they tip better. So tipping is exactly the same or higher in the states that provide a full minimum wage with tips on top. Now, in 2016, when we won this issue in Maine, the National Restaurant Association created we call it AstroTurf, a fake PAC called Save Our Tips, going around the country telling workers your tips are going to go away if your wages go up, which none of the data shows to be true in any of the states that have required a full minimum wage with tips on top. And I think anybody here would be hard pressed to say that you don't get good service in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Las Vegas or Seattle. I mean, these are destination restaurant places
Right.
that provide excellent service. And so, and services, all of the workers there get a full minimum wage with tips on top, robust tips. And I doubt anybody here, when you travel to those places, doesn't tip, because the truth is, Fred, most people don't tip based on how much people earn. Most people don't care when they eat out how much the person earns. They're tipping based on other things, not I'm sure none of you have ever asked a worker when you sat down to eat, how much do you earn, before deciding how much to tip. It is not the basis on which people tip.
No.
And so, no, we're not getting rid of an incentive. If anything, we're spreading the incentive to the kitchen staff, because we're allowing everybody to be paid a full minimum wage and everybody to partake in the tips that are coming in and are higher in the states that do this.
Thank you. We have a question. Charles, unmute yourself.
Okay, I think you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Charles Feldman, Montclair State University. There's a lot of industries where there's a high level of professionalism without tips. What is your opinion? What is your position on that? I mean, assuming that a worker or a server gets incentivized by a high salary, what's your position on no tips at all?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because for years we've been saying that there are many different service professions, right? There's retail, that's a service. You have to interact with customers. Doctors and lawyers deal with customers. I'm a professor. It's a customer service profession. I have to, do well by my students. Imagine if any of those other customer serving professions, incomes, a doctor, a lawyer, a professor, was based on whether or not they pleased their patients, their clients, or their students. We would never allow those professionals'
right
income to be based on whether they pleased the customer or not.
Well, I get that, but I'm not saying cut the salaries. I mean, I'm a professor too. I don't expect my students to give me a tip. I get compensated, and I think that would take away from my professionalism if my students did give me a tip. It certainly would take away, I'd be accused of bias and all sorts of stuff. So in some ways, tipping can take away from an aura of professionalism.
That's right. I do agree with that, which is because we've seen so much data. I said tipping is not based on whether, you know how much a person earns. Unfortunately, Cornell University's research shows that tipping in this country is correlated with bias, with both race and gender bias toward the server. And so that is why we believe a full minimum wage with tips on top is an important first step, because we have seen in the data that it cuts down on the bias. The more that a worker can rely on a wage from their boss, rather than having to rely entirely or even in part for their minimum wage, for their base wage, on the biases of customers, the more you can cut down on that bias. Now, there are restaurants, I know this is your question, that have decided to go all the way and provide a professional salary or an income to workers and get away with tipping, or even move to a service charge. Many employers have moved to a service charge as a way to cut down on bias. And we're supportive of all of those moves, as long as workers are, treated with dignity and respect and don't lose out as a result of those transitions. And as long as we can start with what we believe is the first most important step, that everybody gets just a minimum wage. I mean, I don't think it's too much to ask for. If we believe in this country that there should be a minimum wage, that nobody gets paid less than, then I think it should be applied to all workers, all employers, and let tips be on top of that rather than.
I just want to say I agree with that completely, but if there were no tips at all, there would be no gender bias, there would be no racial bias, there would be no bias. So, to me, that would be the purest form.
I'm sitting here and seeing an educator speak to an educator. All right. And in my head, all of a sudden, I start to realize that what this is, what your job besides the lobbying part is education. What comes down to education. Now, one of the greatest of all of the restaurateurs that is here, Danny Meyer, he cut tipping out and it flopped. Why? Because not only is the restaurants, not only do they have a need to be educated, but the general public. Tipping is so ingrained in us. We're even dumb enough to leave, and the guy who gives you the bag at the pick your own strawberry place, we give that guy $1 because it's on the tip screen. All right. I mean, it's crazy. So how do you as an organization, what are you doing to educate both the pieces to this puzzle?
Yes, I do want to say the reason why Danny decided to go back was not that it failed, but that he didn't see a lot of other restaurants adopt what he did. Now, I do want to clarify that what he did is not what we are pushing for as policy. He went all the way, as Professor Feldman was suggesting, to get rid of tipping altogether. That is not what we are proposing as policy. We're proposing a full minimum wage with tips on top and let tips be shared among all workers. And Danny has said that if that were allowed, that is what he would have chosen, rather than going all the way to get rid of tipping, because what he really was trying to do was create more equity between front and back. And the allowance of paying everybody a full minimum wage and sharing tips between front and back really is a huge, wonderful step towards that. As I said, some employers have gone all the way. I mean, Danny's not the only one to get rid of tipping. There are a number of restaurants all over the country and in New York. Dirt Candy is a restaurant in New York City that decided to go in this way, and they've stayed with it. They've not gone back. Honey Butter Fried Chicken in Chicago is a restaurant that decided to get rid of tipping and stuck with it. So, Danny was not alone. He was maybe the highest profile example and the one everybody heard about, but other people have moved to we see three real different models. One is a full minimum wage with tip sharing, which is the policy we're fighting for. That's the basic, that's the ground level. Some people have chosen to go to a full minimum wage with service charge and then get rid of that bias that Professor Feldman was talking about. And because a service charge is a standardized amount. You can't say, I'm going to give you more because I like your look, or less because you don't allow me to touch you, right? It's a standardized amount. And so that's why many people have moved to a service charge. But the third model is a complete, let's get rid of this model altogether and move to a professionalized salary or income. We're supportive of any of those as long as that base is covered, which is everybody gets a minimum wage from their employer, and any gratuities are on top of that. Now, I do want to say, to your point, Larry, we're now seeing tipping in so many different sectors. Why? Because we've seen so many other sectors look at the restaurant industry and say, well, if they get to pay a sub minimum wage, I want that too. And so we've seen retail operators, we've even seen an airline attempt to introduce tipping and reduce their workers' wages down to a sub minimum wage, which is why we say, look, if you don't want to be tipping in every environment, all over, everywhere you go, we have to get rid of this sub minimum wage. As long as there is a sub minimum wage, it incentivizes more and more sectors to try to get what the restaurant industry has had for 150 years.
So let's get back to the education.
Well, and also hold on a second, Larry, which is, I don't know how that's possible given the tablet mentality that we're in now and the cashless mentality we're in. All you ever face is a screen being turned in your face by a server asking you for a gratuity. So I think it's over in terms of the ability to not, it's part of the expectation.
I don't think it's over, and I'll tell you why. I mean, there is such tremendous tip fatigue right now. I mean, it's very well documented. Tipping has been going down since the pandemic, and people are exhausted from tipping in every environment. And so there is a real backlash against the tablets. And, we're seeing it in lots of customer on Reddit, on lots of customer facing places. And so the more and more we get rid of this sub-minimum wage, all employers are required to pay a full minimum wage. I do think the less the expectation is going to be that you're going to have to tip in every single environment.
Okay. So back to education. All right. What is One Fair Wage doing to educate the public who is, the perfect example is somebody going to Europe for the first time. Europe, everybody knows that European waiters and waitresses are paid a very fair wage there. And yet every American, they see an American, they go, they're going to over tip. In Europe, they leave the change, except for an American who walks in and leaves them 20 euro, which is ridiculous, ridiculous. So what are we going to do to break the uneducated American public that A, one fair wage is a great thing, and B, how do you deal with it?
Yeah. So that's why I've written 5 books, and we have 2 or 3 documentary films about the issue, and working with television producers on television shows. And we are constantly doing consumer education around the country, lots of media like this. I actually think the current talk from the presidential campaigns around no tax on tips has really elevated the issue for everybody to talk about. We all know that that's not the right solution because 2/3 of tipped workers don't earn enough to pay federal income tax, and so they would not benefit from no tax on tips. We also know it's not the right solution because of what happened during the pandemic. If workers' tips are not considered legitimate income by the government, the less it's taxed, the less these workers will be able to access things like Social Security and other government programs that everybody else that gets a minimum wage is able to access. But I do think the elevation of that idea has risen into the public consciousness. Tipped workers, what are they dealing with? The fact that they don't earn enough to pay taxes, the fact that we need to actually raise their wages. In next week, actually, you'll see a Congress member introduce a bill to end the sub-minimum wage and get rid of tax on tips as well. So I do think it's in the public conversation. And most of all, I think the more that we are moving bills and ballot measures, as I said, I'm in Massachusetts. It's on the ballot here. It's a huge topic of conversation all over Massachusetts because it's on the ballot. The more that we advance these bills and ballot measures, the more education we can spread among consumers.
Okay, Bob, you have a question. Bob, we can't hear you. You're muted. Although some people would like that, please unmute yourself.
All right. Sorry. I love your history and your take on this. I have often thought about the relationship, how racist it is, and how it came up through slavery, and it still is racist, I suppose, and even if not in every way described, certainly in an economic way. And your approaches seem very good. But one thing I'm kind of wondering about that seems left out is restaurants have an interest in of course making as much money as they can, staying in business and all that. And the fact that they don't want to pay people indicates that they're probably not running their businesses properly. And I'm wondering if your group or is there any kind of approach to get restaurants to run a better business, to be more profitable, to be able to pay wages like every other business in America?
Thank you so much for asking that, because I forgot to mention when Larry asked what we do, a huge part of our work, which is that we have several former restaurant owners on our staff that run a program called High Road Kitchens, where all day, every day, we are providing training, technical assistance, support, recognition, even small grants. And now we're starting a loan fund to support small businesses to learn how to raise wages profitably. It's a 3-part training that includes a calculator that allows you to input your menu prices and your staff size. And it shows you how to adjust menu prices, how to overhaul your recruitment, training, hiring, promotion, evaluation systems so you can reduce turnover, how to choose, we provide case studies. Do you want a full minimum wage with tip sharing? Do you want to do a service charge model? Do you want to go all the way and get rid of tipping? We provide the options, the case studies, the education, the information, and they can choose how they want to implement it. But you're absolutely right. Part of the problem in our industry is that there's only ever been one way of doing things, and nobody has ever taken the time to show employers there is another way to do this profitably. And here's how, and we can help you figure out your P&L to make it work. You might need to adjust menu prices a little bit. You might need to think about changing your staffing model. You might want to look at how you share tips between front and back in New York. There is a tremendous offset to be gained in that a lot of employers are having to pay back of house kitchen staff a lot higher than the minimum wage. With a full minimum wage with tips on top and tip sharing, you don't have to keep raising wages in the back of the house because now back of house gets access to tips. So there is a lot of ways to do this profitably. Employers have done it. We are able to show them how to do it profitably, and then we're able to bring them into a community of restaurant owners around the country who are doing it so that they can continue to learn from one another. So absolutely, that's a huge part of what we do, and we want to offer that to any small business owner who's willing to talk to us about how it can be done
So
profitably.
you mentioned changing the staffing model. How, give me an like, how would that work? Give me an example of that. In other words, you have somebody who's in the restaurant, the tables are not full. I'm now responsible for compensating that person while nobody is eating in that restaurant, if you will. And it's at its simplest form.
Yeah.
How do I possibly create a profitable business out of that scenario?
Well, the alternative to that scenario is you've got a sub-minimum wage worker at $2 or $3 who's sitting around and has no customers and doesn't get any tips,
Yeah.
right? And so that's not a good solution either.
Or maybe I eliminate table service, or maybe I bring in a robot, or maybe there are other things we haven't looked at.
Well,
that-
I
that-
I do
that
think
fit.
that's always been a threat to us. Oh, if you make us pay more, we're
And it's
gonna.
not meant as a threat.
No, I know. I'm not saying
Yeah.
you. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that has been said to us. And I've got to say, it just hasn't happened in
Yeah.
any of the states where wages have gone up. And why? Why? Why haven't robots taken over the industry yet? It's because people still want to go be served by humans. Like,
Yeah.
if you wanted to be served by a robot, you could go to a vending machine or an automated, you could go to a fast food restaurant. But I do think as Americans, somebody was saying we eat more than anybody else on earth. It's because there's an experience we have in a full service restaurant of being served by humans, of being somebody anticipating our needs, somebody asking us what we want, somebody having a conversation with us. We want that. And all we're saying is that if we want that, then those people have to be paid as the professionals that they are. But to answer your question about what do you do when you don't have a lot of business? Well, this is why, to Robert's point, we are able to help businesses figure out what are your slow times, what are your busy times, how do you increase your busy times, but during your slow times, what's the appropriate staffing? And by the way, when everybody gets paid a full minimum wage and tips are shared, a lot of people found this during the pandemic. There's a new thing that evolves called cross training, where people can learn different aspects of the business from management to front of house to back of house. And if they're paid a full minimum wage with tips on top, they can do a lot of different things. So if they're not serving customers, they could be stocking or perhaps helping out in the kitchen or helping managers. Like if you're not paid a sub, there are all these rules and laws that exist to pay somebody a sub minimum wage. You have to ensure they're interacting with customers 80% of the time. But if they're paid a full minimum wage, they can do a lot of different things, not just interact with customers. And so those are the unique things you can figure out if you are open to a different way.
Okay. I have to call hard stop.
Okay.
All right. One thing I learned about a great interview is when you're done, all you see is the next one. I think we have a whole lot more to talk about. And I want to thank you for being here. But what I want to do now is, before we give our last tidbits of information to the audience, I want to thank our sponsors one more time: Ed Flanagan and Expense Reduction Analysts. There's gold in those invoices that you've been sticking on a pin and waiting for somebody else to look at. If you want to mine that gold, call Ed Flanagan and Expense Reduction Analysts, and they will give you back that money that you've been overpaying. Number two, Eastern Business Solutions, the finest in office equipment. You know, Eastern Business Solutions is large enough to handle every need, but small enough that every single customer is important. So call Eastern Business Systems. So time to say goodbye, as we always do. But Saru, I'm going to put you on the hot seat one more time. Give us that one tidbit of information, that one thing you want everybody to think about when they go home today or after they see this video.
I think the one thing I'd want everybody to think about is that, you know, I think we can all agree that everybody who works deserves to be paid enough to feed their families and cover their rent and be able to cover their bills and pay the gas. And frankly, even for owners, live somewhere close to where they work so that they're not commuting 3 hours to get to their job. I think we can all agree on that. What we need to figure out is how we work together to figure out that sustainable future. And that's what I'm saying we are always willing to do, is to work together with employers, with the industry to figure this out. But change has to happen. What can't happen is we're afraid of change. We're not going to let it happen. Stick our heads in the sand, status quo. That can't happen. What can happen is figuring out change together.
Okay. That's about it for today. Fred, why don't you say goodbye to the people?
I want to thank everybody. Saru, thank you. I know the questions are difficult, and I appreciate your answering them always.
Saru, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
I hope you want to come back again sometime.
For sure. Great question.
Let us know the next time you're on the East Coast, so
All
you don't
right.
have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You know, thank you everybody for showing up today. We appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your questions, and Ed I thank you for your sponsorship. Ed, I just want to announce that Ed has re-upped with us for another year, and we're very happy to have him and his company. And I see that some of the people here want more information. Saru, I will give you their names after the show so you can reach out to them, or somebody in your organization can. And I only have 2 things left to say. Everyone, stay positive, test negative, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a good one.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Bye now.